started maybe around in 1961, or 60 or 61. I became familiar with it in 1963 because out of that organization had a committee. We've heard about the March on Washington, okay, which was in 1963. Well, the Coordinating Council of Community Organizations had a subcommittee called the Ad Hoc Committee for the March on Washington. And that's actually how I began to get involved in civil rights. I volunteered to work on that March on Washington. And so we organized we took about 3,000 people on trains from Chicago to Washington for the March on Washington. And then we had a plane of dignitaries. I think about 40 or 50 dignitaries on planes, but the rest of us were on trains. We had two train cars, not just train cars, but 2 trains of 3,000 people we took to DC. And so black people were getting more activated about rights. And at the same time we were organizing for the March on Washington, there were people in Inglewood who were protesting the schools. The superintendent of schools at that time was a man named Ben Willis. And the schools were very crowded, especially in black communities. So children were going half-day schools and stuff like that. And parents were very distressed about the kinds of education that their children were getting. And they had these trailers, long trailers that they made classrooms out of. And in 1963, the summer of 63, they were going to make an entire school out of these trailers in Inglewood. And so I don't know how many trailers they were probably having, but they were like classrooms, but they were going to make a whole school out of that. And so parents began to be very disturbed and organized. And so the summer of 63, while some of us were working on the March on Washington, other people were protesting in the vacant lots where they were going to put all these, we called them Willis wagons because they were named for the superintendent of public schools whose name was Ben Willis. And people actually came from all over the city, even gangs, some of the Cobras, some of the Disciples, Brothers, some of the Rangers. Lots of people were getting organized. And we would say things, we're fired up, and they were chaining themselves to bulldozers in the mud to stop the construction people from putting those Willis wagons up. And out of that came, I don't know if you've heard about the Chicago school boycott. Out of that, in October of 1963, we had a boycott of Chicago public schools. And we closed the schools down. 99% of children stayed out of school one day to protest the quality of education that children were getting in Chicago public schools. Out of that came, Dr. King was invited to come to Chicago to help with people organizing around problems with schools, problems with segregated housing, and a lot of issues that African Americans and others, but primarily African Americans, were experiencing. So out of King was here in Chicago from probably about 1964 to 1967. And then he was not allowed to come back into the city. And the mayor at that time, the other Mayor Daley, and business people came together and threatened him and told him that if he came back into Chicago, he would be destroyed. They didn't mean killed, but they meant destroyed. So he was not allowed to come back into Chicago. That was a year before he was killed. Well, following King's assassination, then there were what were called riots. But there were so-called riots in places like Detroit and other cities before that. And people just began to burn the black community down. Now, you know, as you get older, you can figure out whether you think people just spontaneously burn the communities down, or whether there may have been some master plans behind that. There is a report, it's called the Kerner Commission Report on violence, on urban unrest. And it was named for a former governor of Illinois named Otto Kerner. And Lyndon Johnson created this commission of various people to look at what was called urban unrest, violence. And one of the recommendations of the Kerner Commission report was that blacks be removed from urban centers and relocated in outskirted communities, suburban communities. Now, that's what's happening in America right now. Projects are being torn down. Black people are being pushed out of housing projects and low-income housing, and they're being pushed out to the suburbs. That's a plan. So I'm just saying, tell you, you need to think about it.
Do you think that if Dr. Martin Luther King was still alive, the violence of our nation would have been,
Will we still have the kind of violence?
Yes.
No. No, I don't. And it's a good question, because we have lost. Well, let me put it this way. In 1963, we had the March on Washington, and there were many African Americans who were leaders in our community who stood on the stage at the Lincoln Memorial and made speeches. Dr. King was only one of them. But we had many civil rights organizations, and we had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, we had CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, we had NAACP, we had the not packing house workers, the Pullman Union. We had lots of organizations back at that time where you had people fighting for black rights. And none of those people are alive today. As a matter of fact, 20 years after the March on Washington in 1983, when they celebrated the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington, hardly any of the people who had been on the stage in 63 were still alive. And if they were, many of them had been, say for instance, Whitney Young, who was a very outspoken leader. He was head of the Urban League, somehow died in Africa, in Nigeria. Malcolm X had been assassinated, King had been assassinated. James Farmer, who was the head of the Congress of Racial Equality, had been beaten so badly with the Freedom Riders that he had lost some of his vision, so that many of those people, 20 years later, John Lewis, who was who is a congressman today, but who was in SNCC, which was the organization that I was in, was beaten so badly in Selma. He's a congressman today in the U.S. Congress. from Georgia, Miles. He was beaten so badly on the first march from Selma to Montgomery that he has a steel plate in his head to this day. They tried to kill him, the police. So we have lost many leaders, people who have stepped forward and to protest and to ask for more rights for African Americans and others. They've been killed, and then you have just smaller organizations and groups of people who have been somehow jailed or immobilized, let's say. So no, if Martin Luther King were still alive today, no, we would not have the violence. We would not have the violence. So we're waiting for the next Martin Luther King to step forward.
Coming soon.
If you could predict, how do you think Woodlawn will be in the near future, the community?
You want the truth or you want the play?
I want the truth.
Well, I just said that there's a plan to move African Americans out of the urban centers. When I was talking about the current commission report, this was one of the